Welcome to Off Code, the show where we ignore the cultural codes and have real and intriguing conversations regarding the Black community and ways we can move forward to human flourishing.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Off Code. I am Monique Duson.
And I am Kevin Briggins, and we have another great episode for you guys today. This is a topic that we've been wanting to talk about for a long time, and it's the topic of education in the Black community. This is something that is kind of been at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. When we talk about the Black community, education often comes up. And so I'm just glad we get an opportunity to finally address it.
I am too. When I have conversations about systemic racism, education is one of the things that always comes up. You know, it is because of either test scores or because of the school to prison pipeline. There's always this conversation of systemic injustice. And so I just want to have some conversations about, what is the school to prison pipeline for people who may not be aware what is happening in Black education. Our guest is Dr. Althea Penn. I met her when I was speaking at the Association of Christian Schools International conference called Rooted earlier this year. She had me on her podcast. We had a whole conversation before we even started the podcast. And so I thought she would be a great guest to be able to bring on and help us start the conversation of Black education, Black youth, Black education surrounding our youth. And it's not going to be the last conversation that we have. At least I hope not, Kevin. We want to make sure that we are thinking about education in the Black community and that we are having a well-rounded conversation and that we are well-informed on these matters. And so let's bring on Dr. Penn. Thank you for joining us. We know that, for our viewers, you just had down south a hurricane and you are in that area. So we just thank you for taking time to come on and talk to us about Black education in the midst of the devastation that has happened down there. You are in that Georgia region. And so there's also the chemical fire at the biolab. And so y'all got a lot going on.
Yes, we do. We have Matthew 24.
Y'all got some revelation. I don't know. It's something going down there. But thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much again for having me.
Well, let's just get started. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what qualifies you to even have this conversation?
Oh, well, first I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm happily married to my high school sweetheart. It's been 40 years, and we are the parents of two beautiful daughters. We have an incredible son-in-law, as well as the most amazing grandchildren. We have 3 grandchildren. And we've been in education now for 4 decades, really. My husband's been a youth minister for years. He teaches Bible at a Christian school. Our daughters are both educators. And I've been a consultant for Christian schools. I've even trained for public schools. I write grants. I actually help launch Christian schools or private schools, from finding land to getting SBA loans, and all of that. So I love research. I love data. I love data-informed practices. And I believe that qualifies me for this conversation. In addition, we talked about, you mentioned education for Black families in the Black community. And so I think just my pen tone qualifies me to speak to that. My personal experiences as a student, as an educator. I've been a principal for years, probably 32 years, and just have served with a lot of different educators and school leaders in problem solving, strategic planning to address different issues that we face in education, and just have been in it, behind enemy lines. I like to say all the time that we're in this battle for the souls of children. And I feel like we're behind enemy lines. We're not, on the front lines. We're actually behind his lines trying to take back the children.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's a very poignant way to think about it. Like, it's very sharp. It's very, it really pierces to your heart to say, we're behind, and
Yes.
definitely in a warfare for our kids. I guess I will kick off a lot of our questions, just in looking at some of the disparities that many people talk about in regards to Black youth and education. Before we dig too deep and into the disparities, can you explain to us what is the education or the school to prison pipeline?
Absolutely. Well, in K-12, it's called school to prison. However, in early education, it's actually called cradle to prison pipeline. And it's a funnel that says their practices and policies, social, economic, environmental factors that put a child at risk of failure or entering to the prison system. It reduces, these factors are supposed to reduce the odds that this child will become a productive citizen. And mostly it's all around minority children. Children that are minorities are more likely to live in poverty than their peers. They're less likely to receive a quality education. And there's so many factors that deal with that, and we can talk about that later. But facing stricter discipline policies in school, being more likely to end up in prison because of discipline and interactions with law enforcement at earlier ages. We're seeing, even on the news, sometimes you see children in handcuffs as early as 6, 7, 8, 9 years old because of challenging behaviors. And so typically that's what the pipeline is.
Okay, so you said a lot there in terms of the cradle to prison pipeline. I've never heard that term before, but that's interesting. What do you think are some of the factors that drive that?
There are numerous factors. The liberals would say it's a racist system, but I think it's so much deeper than that. There is some implicit bias there with teachers. Research has proven that often minority children are disciplined more harshly for minor infractions. And, even I talked about experience. I'm almost 6 feet tall, so I've always been a head taller than my peers in my classes. And so anything that I did was noticed more often. So I experienced that even myself, but I wouldn't say that it was because of my race. But others would say that typically minority students are not given the same opportunities or advantages or maybe the mercy or grace that's shown other children. Teachers lack training sometimes, I think, in cultural competence, even differentiated instruction, learning styles, personality styles, just being able to differentiate. And even today, like, for instance, research says that a child who's born with developmental delays is more likely to have, developmental disabilities or challenging behavior because maybe they just lack language skills, so they can't use their words. And so they're going to solve problems physically. And that's going to put them at a higher risk of being suspended. I was sharing with Monique when she was on our podcast that more preschoolers are expelled from school than high schoolers. And then unfortunately, the numbers pan out to about 3 times of minority children are more likely to be expelled in both high school and preschool. But I think a lot of times that there are just so many explanations because those developmental delays have to do with the home environment, often the pregnancy. There are just many factors. I also, when I'm doing a parent orientation, and I hope I'm not rambling on because there's so many thoughts going through my mind, but often I tell parents, discipline your children at home so that we can discipline them at school. But permissive parenting is also another issue. Fatherless homes, where there's a lack of leadership in the home. So there's so many environmental factors. I don't think racism is the primary factor. However, if you're looking at any liberal research, that's going to be where the ball lands, that it's a racism issue. And I don't think that's it. As I said, I was a Christian principal for 30 years. I just left that role and I became the director of early education at the Association of Christian Schools International about 2.5 years ago. And the students that we received in our Christian school from public school were of all different races, and their infractions, some of them were minor, some were major. For instance, we had a Caucasian student that was actually expelled from the school system for stealing a walkie-talkie and calling it a bomb threat. But then we had African-American students and Hispanic students expelled for fighting. And if you had to ask me which was more serious, I would say the fighting. But would that make me racist? I don't know. Because see, for the walkie-talkie, I probably wouldn't have done they expelled him from the system, not just suspended him, but they expelled him. He couldn't go to another school in the county. I would have maybe suspended him for a day for that walkie-talkie thing, but to expel him, no. And then the other students that were expelled for fighting, of course, it was repeated fighting, but I would try and get to the root issue. And I'm going to be quiet now, but I think I know what the root issue is, and I don't think it's racism.
Don't get quiet now.
I don't think it's fatherlessness. It feels about fathers, bring up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and don't provoke them to anger. So we have an angry generation. And part of it is a lack of meaning and purpose, but part of it is just that lack of male leadership in the home, in the community, in the church, biblical illiteracy, and none of that has to do with racism, right?
Nope, it does not.
It does not. And, I agree with you that if you look at any liberal statistics, it's always going to point you back to ethnicity, skin color, race. It's always some form of racial disparity. And because it's a racial disparity, there's always an injustice. But we tend not to gravitate automatically to that way of thinking. We want evidence. Like, can there be a racial disparity that is the byproduct of injustice? Yes, nobody's saying it can't. But I love that you're bringing up other factors as well. Things that can potentially even the playing field. So how many of these, infractions, or how many of these students are coming from fatherless homes? I've been suspended more times than I am comfortable saying as an adult. And I was always suspended for fighting. Always. And, I can't go down and retrace all my fighting steps. But, I also grew up in a fatherless home. And so part of what I appreciate is the reality or the thought that, hey, there may be other things going into this school cradle to prison pipeline than skin color.
Yeah.
And, you talked about, educators having bias, but that just brings up a lot of other questions from me. We might need 2 shows. But, one of the things that I immediately thought about was, are you saying that educators may be trained to educate, but not know how to deal with disciplinary issues? Or is it that educators are trained to educate, but they don't know how to deal with Black kids?
It's both. Differentiated instruction means I look at your learning style. And there were some studies some years ago that talked about, now people are afraid to say this, but the studies actually said that African-American children, Hispanic children were more likely to be kinesthetic learners, as well as boys were more likely to be kinesthetic learners rather than verbal auditory learners or either visual. And, my two children kind of dispel some of that myth. I have two girls. One is a kinesthetic learner, strong-willed, and then the other one is a visual. And so she's a girl, so she doesn't fit that, data point. But in my experience with students, now I have a grandson that's a visual learner. He's like his Nana. I used to have a photographic memory, and he's like that. He can read anything once and remember it, figure it out, spatial concepts, see you do something once and replicate it. That's a visual learner. But typically the boys I've had did need more activity. They needed, you didn't make it really relevant. You had to talk about something they were interested in. Whereas all girls aren't like that. Like my girl that is a kinesthetic learner, she's just naturally curious. So she'll learn anything. You don't have to make it about cars or dinosaurs or whatever, However, I've taught birth all the way through 12th grade. And all of those students that were minorities, I do feel that activity, which we know it helps to regulate, release those happy hormones, it just puts you in a better mindset and emotional and mental state if you're in a learning environment where you're able to move. You have that freedom to move. And I think a lot of teachers teach the way they learn, which most women are verbal learners or visual learners. So we have posters on the wall, we plaster the wall, so that overstimulates, kids that are visual learners. And then we lecture them to death. And then on the other side, we don't understand ACEs and how trauma impacts a child. So we don't implement trauma-informed practices. And the first one is creating that psychological safety in that relationship, that connection with the child. So I think that, it's a catch-22 situation with children. With teachers, they need training in both trauma-informed practices and differentiating instruction and really teaching, culturally responsive teaching. Now, I hate to use that term because it's been hijacked a little bit, but culture does, your background does come into play. Like I grew up in an agricultural community in the Deep South. And when I read the Bible, it comes to life for me. When you talk about plants and trees and animals and all of that, and I love Discovery Channel, I love all of that. So, that is very interesting to me. However, my younger sister, who's 4 years younger than I am, did not spend as much time on our grandparents' farm. And she could care a little less about anything that has to do with animals, plants. And it's more difficult for her to understand the parables of the Bible, And I mean, that's spiritual. And she has the Holy Spirit's help, So I think we have to take culture and that into context when we're teaching students, whether they're boys, minorities, girls.
Dr. Penn, you said a lot when you were talking about the way teachers need to be trained and what they need to be trained in and ACEs and all those types of things. And the thing that came to my mind is, or the question that came to my mind is, are we asking too much of our teachers, or are we putting everything on the responsibility of teachers and schools and school systems to kind of almost to a degree raise kids?
No, now the state wants our kids. The government wants our kids, but parents are a child's primary teacher always, I believe. God tells us in Deuteronomy 6 to talk to the children about his law, his character, and all of that, his deeds. When we lie down, rise up, when we walk along the way, we're always to be teaching our children, and we're to really know them, just like a husband's supposed to dwell with his wife according to understanding. We're to know our children. When it talks about that in Proverbs 22:6, where it says, train up a child in the way they should go, we should know their bend, and then train them accordingly to how God has intricately woven them together. That's how we're to teach our children. However, when parents need that support, I remember one of the first parents in my school was a widow, and she needed the school. She needed to work. She needed to work outside of the home. She could not. She grew up in the South, in the country, and she did not have the education to teach her child what he needed to know in those higher grade levels. And she's a perfect example of where I feel like the school partners with the church and the family to support those parents in educating their children. And I think biblical truth has to be where we start. So even with that child, my husband used to have a mentoring program for boys, and that was where the church came alongside the school and that mother and, helped her to educate him. But I think teaching is a profession that requires a lot of us. That's why the Bible says there shouldn't be many teachers, because we need to study to show ourselves approved. And, we need to put the work in, to know our students as well as our content that we're teaching. So I think teaching methodology is fundamental for teachers. They really need better equipping. I think, unfortunately, our system now is not designed to do it the way that it should be. It could be class sizes, the textbooks, because they're just not doing a good job of teaching the role of the teacher and the nature of the child or the nature of the student. I think even in one definition, they're blaming the school to prison pipeline on the parent's sexual orientation. And I think that might contribute. I would be confused if my parents are confused about their gender and it's pretty obvious. That would confuse me too. And I might be kind of upset about that, going off at school. So it's a very complex, profession.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I do want to follow up to something you were saying earlier in, how Black and maybe Hispanic learners learn, I guess, versus Caucasian learners and boys learn as opposed to girls. And I want to say the word was kinetic. Do you think that is more nature or more nurture? Like, is this something that you see as, Black kids are born this way and, born with this predisposition to be kinesthetic, or is it maybe something that we learn through culture or things like that?
Yeah, you're talking about the nature versus nurture debate, which, it's both. Dunn and Dunn back in 1965, they did some research on personality style and all of the environmental factors that impact it. And they said 2/3 of your personality and even your learning style could be attributed to environment. 1/3 to genetics, 2/3 to environment. Because a lot of what you experience as a young child is going to inform that. And I was talking about my grandson earlier being a visual learner, but he's also a strong auditory learner. But one of the things that made him that way is his mother read to him in the womb, played classical music to him in the womb. So when he was very young, like maybe a month old, he was cooing in rhyme, like Dr. Seuss rhyme. That's very unusual for a male infant. They develop all of their language skills a little bit later than girls. But he started reading at 18 months, which is also very unusual for a boy, right?
Yeah.
But that's why she was reading to him constantly. And then he picked up phonetic awareness or phonological awareness very quickly. And that had to do with nurture.
Yeah.
That was nurture, his environment. So, we even I was talking about how language skills, if a child doesn't have words to use, they will solve problems with their fists. So kick, bite, hit, whatever, right? And I think that's one of the data points that the Department of Education, as well as the Justice Department, uses to kind of predict who's going to be in the pipeline or not, those third grade reading skills. And, being a private school principal, we've always asked our parents, of younger students, birth to maybe second, third grade, to read to their children every night. And you could see the distinct difference and a child that came from a home, whether it was single parent or two parent, if they read to their child every night, it made a distinctive difference, sometimes 1, 2 grade levels above. We had 4-year-olds reading at like 3rd grade reading levels just because their parents read to them 15 minutes every night, or their parent. It could be one parent. So the environment is huge. The family is where socialization is supposed to take place, and all of those fundamental skills are to be developed. I always tell parents, you're going to pay now or pay later. You're going to invest that time in your child when they're younger and, teach them whether it's academic skills, morality, which Barna's research group says is formed by age 9, right? Moral development. And, if you don't get that in them early, you're going to see those effects somewhere.
What I hear you saying is that this is some part cultural, some part just, the socialization of our kids. Do we read to our kids? How soon do we read to our kids? How much, focus do we have in education that helps to create some of the ways or mold some of the ways that our children learn? And I can hear that. And then on the other hand, I also hear you saying that, some teachers or many teachers aren't necessarily versed in the way that culturally we tend to do things, or the way that a child who may be coming from an impoverished background, a fatherless background, or, some background that may have, you mentioned ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Thank you. These adverse childhood experiences or trauma, so they may not be aware of that. And so that can go into the way that they talk to a child, the way that they discipline a child, not understanding, the voice tone that you use with a kid when they are, in maybe a trauma moment. Maybe they are experiencing a trigger. And now you've come up to a child as an educator and you want to help fix this situation by de-escalating it, but your de-escalation tactics aren't matching the needs of this child in that moment. So, educators are playing a role in it. What I see I think what I see in the broader culture though, when it comes to education is, we need to have tests that reflect the way Black kids learn. I don't really see a lot of conversation, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see a lot of conversation about the way, Hispanic kids learn or Asian kids learn or any other group. This is the way that Black kids learn. So we need to have more conversation on those testings. Is that something that you would say needs to happen? Like if Johnny ate 2 apples and Sally ate 2 apples, how many apples were consumed? 4 apples. I don't understand if they're saying we need to change that to, Johnny had a pack of weed and Sally had a pack of weed. How many packs of weed do we have? Because that might be more of the cultural language than the Johnny and the Sally with the apples. Or are they saying that there's some fundamental way in which testing needs to be overhauled for Black kids? Can you help me understand the testing? Help us understand. Sorry, Kevin, I didn't just took over. I'm going to be quiet after this question.
I understand, because I understand you do get on a slippery slope. However, I have administered standardized tests for years. I still do it even for homeschool families that need support. And some questions are a little biased. For instance, I talked about my background being agricultural, and I'll never forget, we had a test for 4-year-olds. It was a placement test for them to go into the 5-year-old class. And it asked, where did milk come from? Had a glass of milk. Where did this milk come from? It had pictures. It had a picture of a refrigeration system in a grocery store, a cow, and what was the other one? I can't remember what the third option was, but inevitably, children from the city and mostly impoverished children circled the refrigerator in the grocery store, whereas children who had been read to, which weren't always white, they recognize that, milk comes from a cow. And so that's where sometimes they'll say a test is biased. And in that particular case, maybe, but we still need that data in order to inform our teaching. It tells us what we need to teach, I think. So I don't think necessarily that's, I think now we have a knee-jerk reaction. I stopped using one test maker's test a few years back because the questions were so loaded with ideologies that, just were frightening. The two dads, two moms, one question was a reading passage, and it was all about how you practice the Hindu religion, and it had 4 questions about the religion. And I believe it was on a 2nd or a 3rd grade test, but it was all about basically making this religion seem more realistic, more enticing than our one way, Jesus being the one way. And then it had other questions, where they had just changed the name of the person in the situation to a Latino name. And I just thought, that's not doing any good. I do love that pictures on the test now are more, I want to say devoid of race sometimes, like they try to make the people where they could be any race, the skin color is so light or the features or, I like that a little bit because I do think it makes a child feel more comfortable when they see themselves in the pictures or they see someone that looks a little similar to them. It makes the test not seem so unfamiliar, because human nature loves what's familiar. And so I believe in helping children be comfortable. So that's why even when I administer a standardized test, I don't make children sit for it. If they want to stand up or sit on a exercise ball or whatever they want to do without disturbing everyone else, I let them do that. So some children need fidget toys while they're testing, or they might need something in their mouths. So if they need something to chew on or something to drink. But I don't necessarily, I think tests are for ascertaining what a child knows, understands, and is able to do. And I think we're just making the data totally useless now because we're changing so much about the test that it's no longer about the academic skills. A lot of tests really aren't worth what, because like even teaching evolution, it's just confusing to a child. If I came from an amoeba, I have no purpose. I have no one that was, when my brain is telling me I'm wired for relationship, I'm wired for faith, I'm wired for connection. But then this test is telling me I have to believe I evolved. So I think we're getting so far away from biblical truth that the tests really aren't as useful as they used to be. So I understand why a lot of colleges are no longer requiring them.
Hey, we're going to take the next minute to hear from our friends at Birmingham Theological Seminary.
My time with BTS has been a time of theological excellence, but it's also been a time of learning practical personal ministry.
The things that I learned here at BTS, I have implemented them into my ministry.
I was not necessarily planning on getting a seminary degree. I just would choose Birmingham Theological Seminary classes that I was the most interested in, that I thought could help me develop the most. But I ended up getting my MDiv from BTS, and there's so much that I've learned.
I'm really, really indebted to BTS because without it, I don't think I could have gotten this far. I initially started it because I had been called to a church, had no theological education, but knew I needed it. So between having my first child, doing my first job, and having my first church, BTS came in and just sort of helped me to understand what it meant to be a qualified minister and to be a studied minister that could rightfully divide the word of truth.
If you are looking to further your theological study, consider Birmingham Theological Seminary. They have small class sizes and affordable class costs. I love studying at Birmingham Theological Seminary. You can check them out at btseminary.edu. BTS.education. Back to our show.
When there are problems, we tend to view those problems in solution ways that we feel we can bring the solution. So politicians like to believe there's a political solution they can do to change the problem.
Yeah.
Educators like to think there's an educational system thing they can do to change the problem or to fix the problem. And so we identify all these different things in our particular area. But when I just sit back and look at it in terms of like, oh, the characters in the test are gender or racial neutral and all those types of things.
Yeah.
When I think about like Asian kids aren't looking for representation to do well on a test. There's not a bunch of Asian looking kids on the test so they can do well. Like, are these things really things that really matter? Or are those things we just feel like they matter because it's things we feel we control because it's in our realm of expertise?
Yeah, I agree. I think we're dumbing down the test because now there was this book I read some years ago called, I think the title of it was Smart Kids and How They Got That Way. And it compared the scores, the PISA scores for the students from different countries. And, and exactly what you're saying is right, because they compared Asian children and children in Finland to American children, and their tests are not being dumbed down. They're not being, infused with this critical theory material. So I do think, we are losing something. Now, each administration comes up with their own initiative to try and correct the problems. And so No Child Left Behind, I understand that the federal government no longer wanted to continue to give the states funding if the schools were failing, because we were graduating all of these students that couldn't read their diplomas. And so they thought a test would fix that. For K-12, the implementation went really wrong when they attached bonuses and all of that for teachers and administrators based on those tests. But in early education, one of the things I did appreciate about it was more money was funneled into early education to prepare students for K-12. Unfortunately, the schools that had better student outcomes, which are private schools, especially faith-based, Christian schools especially, but there's data out there that talks about the educational outcomes for Christian schools being better than K-12 public schools. And getting that money into faith-based preschools is a challenge. They don't have the same access to child care block grant funding that secular preschools have. And then with K-12, private schools have access, but they're afraid to touch it because they're afraid of government overreach. So then we have Common Core with the next administration saying, okay, we want everyone to study the same standards. But then some states knew they were down, in the number 45 through 50, and they couldn't compete with the top states for rankings in the National Center for Education Statistics database. And they began to implement standards even wrong. And it's like, how do you mess that up? Where you just say, okay, well, this is how we're going to measure, let's say, reading comprehension. So I think as long as we have the sin problem, unfortunately, our public school system is going to be, just at, a terrible disadvantage. There's not anything you can do when you don't start with biblical truth. But then the private schools, the Christian schools, really finding a way to hold each other accountable within each school individually, but then collectively, for really using biblical truth as its standard, for what our students need to know, understand, and demonstrate, and teaching biblical truth, because that's what's going to cause our students to flourish. They were designed by God to flourish. They were designed by God with purpose. Ephesians, I believe it's 2:10, talks about how they were predestined unto good works, and each student has strengths. They have weaknesses as well, But God made us so that our strengths help us to overcome our weaknesses, right? So even if we are at a disadvantage, which, you're talking to someone, my name Althea means, it means rose of Sharon. It's a rose that grows in the desert Sharon over in Israel. And it's a beautiful thing that grows in a harsh place. And that describes my life. And if I could overcome, segregation and things like that, then anyone can. I'm a boomer, and Monique doesn't want to believe it, but I am. I just think we have too many success stories, of children that were impoverished, that were born with disabilities. I even worked at a special needs school for a while, and saw students that were born missing parts of their brain develop social, emotional skills, language skills, cognitive abilities, and flourish, And what caused that to happen was the owner of that school was a Christian. And she believed in Christian values in every classroom, even though it wasn't a Christian school, So, until we deal with the sin problem, the cradle to prison pipeline, the school to prison pipeline can't be dismantled because it's in both parties trying to dismantle it, everyone coming up with the practices and policies. And they each think they're right instead of saying the greatest commandment is right. And if we do that, do unto others as we have them do unto us, what I want my child to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. So I served on the board of a private Christian school when I lived in Augusta, Georgia. And not only was it a private Christian school, but it was tailored to kids in generational poverty. So you had a lot of low-income kids. If they qualify for public housing, they qualify for free tuition, And that school, those kids were thriving because they were in an environment where, number one, expectations were held for them. But also it was a heavily, heavily Christian environment, They learned Christian values and Christian principles, and faith was a part of school, And so all of those elements helped those kids to thrive, even if they went back to their neighborhoods and their communities were harsh and, troublesome. They had a foundation in which they could, gravitate and hold on to that would keep them away from those pitfalls.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And those kids thrived in schools, and they were from the same backgrounds and poverty situations as the kids that were in the public schools. And there was a stark difference.
Absolutely. I have 6 of the 10 ACEs in my own life. And so I can testify to that. And we had many students came from impoverished backgrounds, single parent homes. The difference was they agreed that our standard, our statement of faith was what they believed, and they accepted even the discipline for the school. Now, the challenge right now is because of the pandemic, parents are more aware of what happens in public school, and they're starting to flee to Christian schools. And our Christian schools are not ready for a lot of the students, and the parents are bringing the expectations that they have for public school into private Christians. For instance, the social promotion, students not doing the work and getting graded for it. I don't know what teachers are expected to grade, those types of things. And that's that sin nature, again.
I'm listening to you, and we did not even get to the conversation that I thought we was going to get to. But this whole idea of a school to prison pipeline or a cradle to prison pipeline. So I study sociology. This is one of the main things that we learned in my early sociology classes is about this school to prison pipeline. I'm starting to doubt some of this because one, it is a lot of a cultural issue. I think what I hear you saying is a lot of these issues are sin issues. And as long as sin is present, as long as we aren't moving the gospel forward, as long as people aren't in relationship with Christ, we're going to see these issues continue to cycle through.
Yeah.
But what we do see, and this is some of the reading that I've done on this, is even if you don't know Jesus, when you implement some people are implementing biblical principles by accident. Some people are, they're reading to their kids. They are intentionally, keeping their kids inside and away from the culture. They are wanting to make sure that their kids are in bed on time, that they are doing their homework, that they are, spending intentional time with their kids.
Dinner.
Dinner, breakfast. We don't see a lot of those same numbers, even though that child is living in the hood and living in poverty. And so, I'm like, everything gets thrown onto the education or the school to prison pipeline, and it gets thrown onto Black students. We need representation. If we don't have representation, then kids are more likely to enter into the school to prison pipeline. But Asians don't need representation. What is it about Black kids that need Like, why do we need to see somebody who looks like us to know that 2 + 2 = 4?
Yeah.
It causes me to question or reconsider some of what I've been taught about the education and prison pipeline.
Now, there's something to some of it. Like I was talking about in our podcast about appreciating others' culture. And one of the things I was talking about was not the mysticism, superstition, but like language. I do notice, like I used to be the tester. I did the testing for one school. When students would come in, I would do our admissions testing, placement testing. And if English was not their primary language, I tried to greet them in their primary language. Right away, you would see the student they were already like tense and their shoulders were up and all of this. And when I would greet them in their primary language, I didn't know the whole language, but I would just try and greet them in that. Their shoulders would drop down, they smile really big. And so that's where I do think that part, sometimes you do, in order to connect with a student, have to seem like you understand their background, something about their background. You don't have to speak their language, but I'm just saying that part I do think is true, especially for students that are maybe not Native American, they weren't born here in America. But it was true for even children that were born here that spoke a different language, that their primary language was different. They just felt more comfortable when I greeted them in their home language. When they came into the classroom, like we had a little girl that came from India who was an orphan, and she was adopted by someone here in America, a family in America. Before she came, I had our class study about the area she was coming from. She was going to be a fifth grader. Fifth graders are emotionally just starting puberty all over the place. And, it was a Christian school. So, of course, we were talking about social manners, how we would treat her. We wouldn't want to make her feel other than, No, we did all that research. And when she came, true enough, her life experience was so very different. But it gave the kids a starting point to talk to her about her culture, So that's what I mean when I talk about being culturally responsive. Not embracing the craziness, but, it was great. We thought we knew about caste systems, but when she told us how they were treated as orphans, we were like, oh no, the textbooks don't even do that justice. We didn't read anything about that. We never would have imagined you went through that, So I think that's so important. But also on the other side of the coin, 20% of students at Ivy League colleges check all the boxes for being in the school to prison pipeline. If you go read the data, 20% of them qualify for Pell Grants. Their ACE numbers are more than 5. They were like maybe brought up in a home where there was domestic violence or a single parent home or, where there was divorce. The numbers are even higher than the 20%, but the 20% is the number for the Pell Grant recipients in Ivy League schools. So when you go from there on up, you're like, okay, the excuses are all taken away. How did they get in Ivy League schools if, if it's just race and poverty, you know?
Yeah, I'm not saying that cultural responsiveness isn't important or that we shouldn't, want to meet kids where they are. I love, the thought of greeting the child in the language that they might speak at home and being able to connect with them and let them know, like, hey, I see you. I am glad that you're here. And I don't know that cultural responsiveness is the main factor for why Black kids find themselves in this quote unquote education to prison pipe. I think that's where I am struggling to make that connection. I am becoming more convinced that it is the sin of the culture that participates largely. Not saying that cultural responsiveness doesn't have any validity or, play any role in a child feeling like they belong, or that, there's also space here that they're seen. I know all of that is important too. But if we're going to talk about, the trajectory that a child is on that starts in the home, I'm asking the question, is it the home or is it the school? Is it the home or is it a system?
It's the home because, there's so much research. Maslow, with the hierarchy of human needs, the bottom level is at home. Food, safety, belonging, all of that starts right at home, So, all truth is God's truth, right? So I definitely believe Maslow before Bloom. And then the research with the nature versus nurture. I think it's so important that home environment has, in Hosea 4, it talks about how my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. And it's not that they don't have access to the knowledge, opportunity. It's that they rejected God. He's talking about the people of Israel, but it's still a truth for us today. The word tells us how to train up our children, but we think we can do it better. It tells us how to teach them, and we think we could do it better, and we can't. So that hedonism, that secular humanism, as long as that's what's on the throne, and not the word of God, we're going to see, these negative outcomes just because people are sinful. And what can you expect from sinners but sin,
Yeah. I struggle with the liberal research because when I read it, I feel like whoever did it had no experience on the ground in the hood. That's how I feel. I feel like it's a strictly, academic silo, because from my experience growing up in the hood and going to inner city schools, the issue was not the system. The issue wasn't systemic racism. It wasn't even the test. The issue came down to whether or not the kids that came to school wanted to learn. So the kids that came to school that wanted to learn, that did their homework, that made good grades, that had some type of expectations at home. Because I'll just say this, I wasn't allowed to bring bad grades home. It was just, I would have been in a whole lot of trouble. But some of my peers didn't have that. They can make D's and F's. There was no repercussions at home. There was nothing. They can come to school and just be the class clown and cut up and, and this is the thing, we have Black teachers, we have Black principals. There was no white supremacy in our school or in our neighborhood. It was all us, right? And these kids, you got the product, you got what you put in, right? And so when I look at, people making all of these outside excuses for what's really an internal problem, I feel like that the solutions they're coming up with are the reason nothing has changed, because they refuse to accept that it's an internal problem, And as long as we keep focusing on external circumstances and external factors, will never change the root causes of why is it that these kids are going off the rails. And it's really because there are many internal cultural factors. And you started off by saying it's fatherlessness. That's kind of where it starts. But the culture that leads to fatherlessness is more so what is to blame, and that's what we can't talk about. That's what we don't look at, because that's not a political solution. That's not a system solution, right? And those are things that are hard to address and hard to change. It's hard to change people, And so I feel like we struggle with that. And if we want different outcomes, we have to really say, okay, what is the root causes of this, and address those root causes.
I agree. I think about Daniel, Esther in the Bible, and I know people don't like to look at biblical characters, but why did Daniel thrive in Babylon? The same reason that students today can thrive in Babylon, the modern day Babylon, is that they have biblical principles that they are convicted by, that they live by. That's how he was able to thrive. That's how Esther was able to thrive. You look at even other biblical characters, there's so many, even Jesus himself, even without the support of his family, when he was starting out in ministry, his brothers didn't believe in him, sisters didn't believe in him. What caused him to thrive? He was the Word. But when children have the Word of God hidden in their hearts, it just causes them to thrive. I've seen students that really should not have overcome obstacles that they had. Maybe a parent was incarcerated, or a mother died from cancer and the children were left with a father. I remember in one particular instance, the mother was Christian, the father was a Muslim, and she was diagnosed with cancer. And in her will, she willed that her children stayed in the school, and she knew that her husband would want to take them out, so she made sure she put that in the will, put the tuition in there and everything. And even though the father was not as engaged as you see most Muslim men are, this little girl thrived even in the face of her mother passing from a very brutal battle with cancer. And I was just so concerned with her when she grew out of the grade levels we carried, going somewhere else. But later in life, I'm seeing that she's still thriving. And she's thriving because of those biblical principles that she lives by. And she's, professed Christ. I think that makes the difference. I say he's always the great equalizer in any situation, because God rules in justice and righteousness. Social justice doesn't work unless it's biblical justice. And God reigns where there's righteousness. He has to show up. He has to fulfill his promises, right? He has to make sure there's justice. So I think that's the key, is getting back to those biblical values in our homes, our communities. And I'm really all in support of homeschooling, especially if it's biblical. Any type of education that's biblical, because it's going to have those biblical outcomes. Like you said, biblical principles work just like natural laws.
Everything you said is just drawing me back to when I think about the Black community, when we were at our strongest, because we were rooted in biblical principles. We were rooted in the church. And then secularism came along, and the sexual revolution, and the war on poverty created all of these single parent homes, and we had the I don't need a man generation. And we left biblical principles as a community and adopted principles of the world, and we're still looking for the world's principles to solve our problems, instead of realizing we left what made us strong. We left what really works. And when I think about the idea of, faith, religion, all that kind of stuff being taken out of schools, I think we're just reaping I won't say the benefits, we're reaping the consequences of our actions. And we are kind of struggling to get back, because we don't want to admit that's the problem. From a secular standpoint, they don't want to admit that's what the problem is. So yeah, I agree. Everything you're saying is really, it's going back to, we need to get back to that, to those principles, to those truths.
If you are finding our content valuable, will you please consider donating to the Center for Biblical Unity? The Center for Biblical Unity seeks to equip believers biblically to address the cultural issues we're seeing today. Our goal is to share the message of hope through the gospel that provides our unity. Your support is invaluable to helping us spread a gospel message to a very curious world. To donate to the Center for Biblical Unity, please go to centerforbiblicalunity.com and click on the donate button. Thank you. As we start to wrap, what encouragement, wisdom, advice do you have for parents of, K to 12 kids, especially parents who may have their kids in a public school who don't feel like, homeschooling may not be an option, private Christian school isn't an option, and now, their kid, I'm thinking about like the junior high school that I went to, Horace Mann or John Muir, or, like one of those junior high schools that was like, it was hood. It was in the hood and it was real hood. Like kids was getting stabbed on the regular at John Muir. So like, but, these are parents who are definitely concerned about their kids, who want their kids to get good education. They're believers. How do they fight for their children in that space? And then also, like, how do they encourage their kids, to not get wrapped up in the culture or to, become a part of that?
It starts with relationship, really connecting with your own children. So many parents have turned the parenting of their children over to social media, celebrities. So getting back to eating meals together, reading the Bible, worshiping together in church, because the word works. The students that I see thrive when my husband, I saw even when my husband was a youth minister, the students I saw that thrive that were in public school, which our kids were even there for a period, they were the ones whose families spent time with them. I remember when I was growing up on Sundays, having dinner with my grandparents and them asking us questions about our week and how we solved problems and giving us wise counsel. That time with family, even biblical community. I have a group of women that we've kept our families together for 30 years, and all of our children, whether they were in public school, Christian school, or homeschool, are strong believers even now because they were brought up together in the Word. We served together in churches together, and we're spread out and scattered all over the world, basically. But we had that connection, which is the Word of God, and those really strong relationships that hold us accountable in our marriages, in our parenting, even in the workplace and ministry. So I think that's really important, that biblical community starting with the family, just spending time together in the Word, turning off the devices, turning off the television, just talking and listening to your children about these things and issues that are happening in the world.
Yeah, it starts with a relationship. It starts in the home and then outward. Kevin, we are at time. Is there anything else you want to say? Any closing thoughts, words of wisdom?
Yeah, I got a whole list of questions here we never got to.
Dude, I know. I know. Like, we literally answered question number 1 and number 2. I don't know what to do with the rest of those questions, except for maybe have a part 2. But I think this is a great foundation. Like, it's a good conversation just about education overall, and looking into what are some of the issues. Like, one of the questions that we don't have a lot of time, and I know that you are down there in the hurricane zone with no air conditioner. Like, we don't want to take all your time, but we never got to like school discipline. Are Black kids disciplined at higher rates, and is it unfair, or are Black kids coming with the culture into the school. And so now they're bringing the outside culture into the school where, maybe in a lot of your more, middle class white culture, that isn't a thing. We have to have you back. We gonna have to have you back, I think. Yeah, because we can't sit on here for 19 hours, even though I know I wish we could. I wish we could. All right, Kevin. You'll come back? Okay.
I'll come back.
Sorry. And Kevin, it's my fault. I know I talked the whole time.
I'll be honest. I did not know Dr. Penn was going to be this faith-based. I didn't know. So once we were down that road, I was glad to go down that road. So.
Oh, sorry. I didn't. Yeah. Okay. So we will come back with another question. Here is what you can do if you are watching. You can, in the comments, put your questions to help us form our next conversation. That would be awesome, because now it's not just us. We're actually taking your questions about education, Black education, the education system in America, and we are able to ask Dr. Penn directly. So make sure that you add your questions to the comments. Also, add your comments about the show overall. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think it's something completely different? Maybe neither nature nor nurture. Maybe it's something else. We are so grateful that you are watching, that you hang out with us on the second and fourth Sunday of every month. Thank you for joining Off Code. Dr. Penn, thank you so much for hanging out with us. We look forward to having you back again. Kevin, it's been real.
It has been, as always. Until next time, y'all. Peace.
Bye.